There are some logos that are, much as I hate the term, iconic. The Coca-Cola signature, the Nike swoosh, the McDonald's arches. You look at them and you instantly know what they represent. In Britain, we have this one, which I would argue is equally deserving of the title. This is the British Rail logo. And the way this one tops all the others is, it's still in use even though British Rail hasn't existed for nearly 30 years. Just about every station on the national rail network, other than those operated by municipal authorities, has the BR logo. It's sometimes called the double arrow. The journey to get there was quite a curious one, and that's what I'm here to talk about today. In 1948, the railways of Britain were nationalised. This was something that various people had pushed for quite some time. But in the wake of the Second World War, the railways were in a simply dreadful state. The Prime Minister at the time was Clement Attlee of the Labour Party, who was generally pretty favourable towards state control. So, between the ideals of the government and the need to keep things running, nationalisation had become a far less controversial proposition in recent years. The bulk of the new nationalised rail system was made up of 4 companies: the Great Western Railway, the London and North Eastern Railway, the London Midland and Scottish Railway, and the Southern Railway. Immediately following the takeover, their workshops kept going more or less as they had been. It's just that instead of the name of their old owners, locomotives would be turned out with British Railways on the sides. But if the public were to be convinced of the merits of this new system of railways, British Railways would need to differentiate themselves more effectively. That meant a unified corporate identity. BR were heavily influenced by London Transport, which itself was based around the old Underground Group. London Transport, and formerly the Underground Group, had a solid corporate identity. The roundel logo was all over their buses, trains, coaches, trams, and stations. They had consistent colour schemes and architecture, all of which denoted an efficient, familiar transport network. In fact, the British Transport Commission, the government organisation in charge of both British Railways and London Transport, actually approached London Transport for advice. LT were unwilling to assist because they didn't really want to get involved in internal politics. So instead, BR turned to Cecil Thomas. Now, the people who had devised the London Transport corporate identity came from backgrounds of modern art and advertising. Thomas was a designer of medals and seals. He was more heraldic. And so he came up with a relatively complex design: a lion atop a wheel, with the name British Railways emblazoned on a bar across. It was clearly inspired by the London Underground roundel, but whereas that symbol had been simplified over the years, Thomas had come up with something more complicated. The Commission were not at all happy with it, but nevertheless it ended up on locomotives. It was known as the lion and wheel symbol, but among railway enthusiasts it was the cycling lion. A.J. White, BR's head of advertising, had another go at it. He had come from the London and North Eastern Railway, who were much better at the corporate identity thing than most railways. He came up with another symbol inspired by the London Transport roundel, which is known as the British Railways totem, but is popularly nicknamed the hot dog. This could be rendered in appropriate colours for each of the British Railways regions, and was easily reproduced in advertising and on signage. The official typeface was Gill Sans, which was inspired by London Transport's Johnston alphabet and was considered to be clear and modern. Oddly enough, BR stuck with the Thomas symbol on locomotives. The next big change would come about because of more politics. I really hate talking about politics in my videos, but when you're dealing with the history of the railways, you kind of have to. What happened was that in 1951, the Conservative Party under Winston Churchill was back in charge, and they did not approve of this nationalisation malarkey, but they were kind of stuck with it. By way of compensation, the British Transport Commission decided to take BR backwards, design-wise. They wanted an even more old-fashioned logo, one that wouldn't reek of modernity and socialism. So in 1956 they went for official heraldic arms, featuring a much more intricate lion holding a wheel, sitting in a crown decorated with the leek, symbol of Wales, a thistle representing Scotland, a rose representing England and an oak leaf representing Great Britain. A modified version was used for coaches, multiple units, and some locomotives. Neither version was well received by commentators in the design business, who considered it overcomplicated, cramped, and difficult to read. The unofficial nickname for this iteration was the Ferreton Dartboard. Unfortunately, in general, this was something of a dark age for the railways of Britain. Much of the rolling stock was old, and many of the new locomotives were unreliable and badly built. Under Dr. Beeching, hundreds of miles of railway had been closed. Stations were gloomy and grimy. Satirists suggested that the change of logo represented a change in the status of the railways. The old symbol suggested that Britain was built upon its railways. The new one suggested that the railways relied on Britain's support. Meanwhile, the different regions of the network were asserting their own identities. What was happening was exactly what the Transport Commission had hoped to avoid in 1948. A messy, old-fashioned, incoherent railway. The very same conservative politics that had led to the Ferreton Dartboard would lead to the next big change in the 1960s. In 1962, the British Transport Commission was dissolved. BR's controlling body would now be the British Railways Board. The BRB's design commission was led by George Williams. Williams absolutely despised the then-current corporate image, which he saw as a throwback to Victorian design principles. If, as the government wanted, BR was to be competitive with other forms of transport, then they would have to bring things up to date. They went to the Design Research Unit. The DRU had been founded in 1943 by some of the top names in British design: Misha Black, Marcus Brumwell, Milner Gray, and Herbert Reed. They advised a clean, simple design philosophy. This was first experimented with in Glasgow, where it was felt that the suburban electrification scheme offered an opportunity to break with the past. FHK Henryan came up with a sort of double chevron logo, representing, in abstract form, a pantograph and the River Clyde. He also adopted the new rail alphabet, designed by Jock Kinnear and Margaret Calvert. The scheme was considered a success, and so the BRB set about applying the same principles to the entire network. In 1965, the new designs were exhibited at the Design Council in London. Signage would be in the new alphabet. The corporate colours would be red, blue and grey, and the organisation as a whole would be named British Rail. Also on display was the logo that would be replacing all versions of the British Railways symbol. This had been a major head-scratcher for the DRU. The symbol was supposed to go everywhere, on everything. From trains to tickets, stations to sandwich wrappers, ships to seat covers. It should be instantly recognisable, even at a distance. It should be easy to reproduce, ideally monochrome. And it should represent British Rail in an easy-to-understand way. Dozens of designs were put forward, but two led the way. One, by Collis Clements, consisted of two interlinked circles and an arrow, to represent a wheel moving forward. The other one was by Jerry Barney, who wasn't even a designer, but worked for the DRU as a craftsman. He drew up his basic sketch on the way to work and submitted it, not particularly expecting it to be chosen. But his simple concept turned out to be exactly what the DRU were looking for. It's known as the double arrow symbol, and represents two trains moving in opposite directions on parallel railway lines. British Rail were equally happy and announced the new logo to the world. In June 1965, they put out a design manual covering all facets of the new corporate identity. Whatever else you could say about British Rail at the time, it can't be denied that the new identity was a radical change. You wouldn't believe that this was the same company that had okayed this symbol a decade prior. By this time, the Labour Party were in power again, and while they might not have been fond of the idea of nationalised railways competing with private companies, they were fine with the new identity. To them it represented futurism and technology. As the fortunes of the railways changed, so satirists once again seized on the logo. They joked that it represented an organisation that didn't know which way it was going. It was nicknamed the Arrow of Indecision. In the 1980s, BR again moved away from a single corporate identity, bringing in sectorization, new divisions of the network based on type of traffic rather than region. Each sector had its own livery, but the double arrow remained as a symbol of the network as a whole. In the 1990s, another Conservative government had the network privatised. British Rail would cease to exist as it was broken up between 1994 and 1997. But something funny happened. Even though the company had gone, the logo remained. It was so effective that it remained useful as a generic symbol. It would no longer appear on trains, but it would be used on tickets, at stations, and basically in any context where it was useful to have a general, shorthand way of saying railways. In 2022, it was very slightly redesigned to make it easier to reproduce on things like mobile phone screens. It's to be used by Great British Railways, the public body that is to take charge of Britain's railways. All things considered, I think it's safe to say that it's a design classic. Well, I hope you enjoyed today's video. If so, please do leave a like and consider subscribing for more. I'd like to thank my donors on Ko-fi, on Patreon, and here on YouTube for your support. You are the DRU to my BRB. And I'll see you all again very soon. Cheerio.